What can be done to solve the issue of land occupations? Well, the South African Institute of Race Relations Project Manager, Terence Corrigan, joins me now in studio. Terence, thanks for your time. You've been watching, as the rest of the country has been, these land occupations and the illegal land invasions. What do you make of them?
Well, look, I think they're fundamentally the product of socio-economic stresses, failure of the economy to grow sufficient jobs for opportunities for people, and this, of course, has a knock-on effect on people's ability to provide for themselves. What we've been seeing recently in Protea Glen, for instance, is predominantly an urban phenomenon, and this is not surprising because South Africa is a rapidly urbanizing society. And across the world, whether in Brazil, you know, around cities like Rio or Sao Paulo, or in Asia, around Beijing, Shanghai, Jakarta, you see the same things happening. People come into the cities. One of the foundational things is to find somewhere to stay. And this will inevitably lead them into conflict with residents who already have established rights. It's something that we're seeing very powerfully in Protea Glen. Ultimately, though, countries which achieve high rates of economic growth, employment, and that sort of inclusionary economic dynamic, these problems tend to resolve themselves. Our problem in South Africa is that we haven't been able to achieve that.
And of course, part of the complexity too, you talk about Protea Glen, there are also residents who've been living on the outskirts of Protea Glen, so not necessarily in the heart of the suburb, which is, you know, one of the more leafy suburbs of Soweto, if I can put it that way. And they've been waiting for housing for, you know, decades, as some of them have told us. To the extent that not necessarily all of them are new as part of urban migration. How does that become resolved as an issue?
Well, you know, I think that's the kind of Siamese twin of the or conjoined twin of the urbanization issue. The lack of economic growth paired with severe inefficiencies at local government level, and simply sometimes the inability of our municipalities to cope. This is something that one sees throughout the country. When it happens in a place like Soweto, you know, the old adage, Soweto sneezes, South Africa catches a cold. It's very telegenic and it attracts attention, but it certainly isn't unique. You mentioned waiting for years. I mean, housing lists have been a major cause of service delivery protests. Once again, you know, the allegations that swirl around about favoritism and, you know, people who somehow are able to bump their names up. But once again, you know, experience from elsewhere in the world suggests that you know, when economies are growing at 5, 6, 7%, people are earning incomes. The dependence on the state to provide for them becomes less important. You know, people are able to make their own plans. Unfortunately, once again in South Africa, that is that's something that we simply haven't been able to do. And over the past 10 years, particularly, it's become a particularly serious problem.
And of course, the issue of land is not just important because of what it represents physically, but one almost, I guess, the sense, Terence, that there is a metaphoric meaning for why and how some of these protests are taking place as a means of expression for the inefficiencies and the failures which you're describing.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, look, I think, and I've written about this, the idea that that land is often not about land. Land is a metaphor; it's an avatar, and I think there is a very strong element of it here. I think when one talks about land and, you know, uses the land word, I think what the protests in Protea Glen foreground to us is just how important this issue is in an urban setting. Our polling shows, for instance, that there is the demand for urban land for housing, if you like, is a far more important issue for South Africans than rural land or agrarian reform. Yet it gets very little of the attention. Well, once again, I think here to some extent we have ideological and symbolic issues that often push out the practical ones. Now, in cities, something else that I think we often struggle with in South Africa is the expectation for the type of urban housing that we want. The idea that you'll have a freestanding house with a little garden or something like that. Urbanization on the scale that we're seeing, where you have millions of people packed together, generally has to go upward. Yet that's something that I think our urban planning hasn't really caught up with, and I think for deep cultural reasons, it's not something that people feel comfortable with. But I think as a city like Johannesburg or like Cape Town expands, that is an option that is going to become increasingly necessary.
Just before I let you go, perhaps drawing on lessons from other countries, in the absence of the economic growth that would almost indirectly deal with some of the difficult issues of survival that are leading, or rather that are exacerbating the issue of land, what can the country do, very briefly?
Look, I think that we have to interrogate our policy environment. Is it conducive to that sort of economic growth? And we at the Institute of Race Relations have been very critical of some of the choices that have been made. I think that we need leadership that is able to communicate messages about what is possible, but also to up the standard of administration. I think a lot more transparency with things like housing lists, for instance, would be a good thing. I think we also have to recognise something. What we're seeing in Protea Glen shows that South Africans across the board are attached to the idea of private property, where you see residents of what was a township community, becoming very agitated about threats to their property rights. And polling shows that South Africans, across the board, want to own. They want their little piece of South Africa, and I think our policy has to put that front and centre.
All right, thanks for coming into studio. Terence Corrigan, he is from the South African Institute of Race Relations.